Tired of boring old AI? Well, now we're getting space AI. NVIDIA has sent the strongest signal since SpaceX's filing for 1 billion orbital data centers that AI is going to expand to Earth orbit. They announced 3 new chips and 6 new partners to position their hardware for the AI space race that gained tens of thousands of new entrants this week.
Space manufacturing was busting this week as providers Apex, York, and Reorbit all sell spacecraft for communications applications. Some interesting financials came out of these deals as York sells close to $200 million just after their IPO, and Reorbit participates in an emerging space leasing trend with SLI.
If you don't want to ride the bus, there's plenty of rockets available. ISAR wins a customer days before their next launch attempt. Reaction Dynamics gets funded under Canada's Launch Sovereignty Program, and Rocket Lab wins their biggest contract yet for their HASTE platform after successfully launching a Strix satellite.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Space Times Podcast. As always, I'm Paul Mayer.
Here with Harrison Lambert.
Excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Subscribe to our newsletter if you want the written breakdown of our episodes emailed to your inbox every Monday morning. Drop us a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. And as always, please listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, wherever you're receiving this signal.
Some extra exciting news for us is that we will be at SAT Show, providing media coverage from March 22nd through 26th. SAT Show is a conference combining the satellite event with GovMilSpace event to provide a gathering of industry and thought leadership around the space industry in general, with a focus on defense interests. If you plan to join us there, use discount code SPACE012, that's lowercase space 012, at checkout to save 20% on your ticket. Please reach out to us if you're interested in meeting at the event, and we look forward to seeing you there. Our main topics for this week include orbital data centers, Earth applications, and rockets. To start things off, orbital data centers has had a huge week. It's been an emerging trend that's been very popular recently, with companies like SpaceX announcing 1 million satellites to deploy AI at scale in space. But one of the stronger signals coming out this week is that NVIDIA is actually developing chipsets particularly positioned for this emerging trend. NVIDIA announced the Vera Rubin module this week that has a 10 times improvement on compute per watt over some of their more traditional chipsets that are kind of being used already by some of these space players. So that's a 10 times improvement over their Blackwell processor, but they also announced their Thor and Orin processors. The Orin's a bit more established, and altogether they offer quite a few different options for doing compute on orbit. The Orin's more positioned for like insights on imaging, and some of them are 25 times more efficient than the H100, which is a chipset that's been launched previously, including on StarCloud. These chips are positioned well to allow some of these space data center players to use the hardware for power-intensive compute on orbit. One of the main restrictions to orbital data centers is power consumption, the other being thermal. So I expect some news coming out about these chipsets in the future about either producing less heat or being able to run at higher temperatures. But for now, it seems like they're positioning some of these chipsets to be very particularly low power consumption for the compute that they can output. Some of these are interesting improvements over, like I said, the H100 and the Blackwell, which are used in previous announcements from some of these space companies. Like StarCloud has launched H100s in their first mission. And recently, Sophia Space got a $10 million fund to use the Blackwell processor in their space data center play. So it'll be interesting to see how these advances play out in the architectures of some of these players, especially since they have much more explicit partnerships with NVIDIA now. NVIDIA previously was only announced to partner with StarCloud and some smaller partnerships, but StarCloud was kind of the primary public one. But now they're announcing their partnership with Aetherflux, Axiom Space, Kepler Communications, Planet Labs, Sophia Space, and as I said, StarCloud. Some of these are really interesting to note. Axiom Space and Kepler in particular recently launched a data center on Kepler's Tranche 1 of satellites. They launched 2 Axiom Space data centers on there for real-time streaming through their optical communications relay that can both do inter-satellite between their 10 satellites on orbit, as well as space to ground. The other interesting one is Planet Labs, as they previously announced their Suncatcher effort with Google, which when they announced it, was planned to use Google's TPU units, which are one of the few alternatives to NVIDIA's hardware. So it's interesting to see Planet Labs expanding into another hardware provider. I'm waiting to see how this plays out in terms of competition between two of them. If Planet Labs can create kind of an agnostic platform for some of these hardware providers. And lastly, Sophia Space being interesting, as I noted, because they use the Blackwell processors in their architecture they announced last week with their funding raise. And similarly with StarCloud using the H100, I'll be curious to see if they transition over to using these new Vera Rubin chipsets.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what about the Vera Rubin chipset allows for this type of sort of scale and proliferation. The fundamental physical challenges that on-orbit data centers need to overcome basically boil down to power consumption and heat dissipation. And so, some sort of balance of the chips being too power intensive or not being able to provide the power necessary to get them operating, or some combination of that on sort of the inlet, or not being able to disperse and get rid of the heat that's generated quickly enough on the outset. That's been a lot of the sort of pushback and a lot of the, I'll say, rainy day naysayers with regards to orbital data centers. So I'd be very interested in seeing what the Vera Rubin model is able to do relative to sort of the prior generation of chips and the processors that were out there. That, the players that we've seen have been more so data storage, orbital data storage, than actual processing or actual compute on orbit for precisely those sort of power consumption and heat generation concerns. So if this next generation cuts down on sort of the heat generation and is able to disperse heat that much more efficiently, or is able to operate as efficiently at higher operating temperatures, some combination of things to that effect, we could see a lot of prior barriers really come crashing down.
Yeah, and one of the other restrictions on kind of these distributed networks of GPU compute is the interplay between the actual compute units. So within the proposed chipsets that NVIDIA is laying out, some of these are interesting to note that, like Vera Rubin is not just a GPU, it's actually a GPU combined with a CPU. And they use their NVLink technology to kind of tie it all together. Similarly with the Orin Jetson compute unit, it's a GPU combined with a CPU for image processing and more like AI on the edge applications, rather than these orbital data centers for like inference engines, just kind of scaling out data centers to space. So one of the aspects is like networking between units on the same spacecraft is a challenge. NVIDIA's kind of solved that. One of the challenges that is yet to really be solved at this scale is interplay between different satellites. Optical data terminals is another trend that's really been, dominating recently. And I think it serves to solve some of these problems. Like we've seen with Blue Origin's TeraWave project, using optical data terminals to get up to 6 terabits per second transfer data rate between units. And I think this kind of capability is playing out in the architectures that these companies are proposing. Just this week, Blue Origin filed Project Sunrise, which is their plan to launch 51,600 orbital data centers into space. This is positioned to play well with their TeraWave constellation. As we've seen a lot with these orbital data center plays, you need that communication data layer in order to connect all of these terminals so that latency doesn't kind of blow up on you when a satellite's kind of out of range. If you're computing on one node, you have to be able to move it to another node when it's out of range, so they all play together well. So I think Blue Origin is positioned well to kind of leverage their TeraWave, which is a yet to be deployed system, kind of in succession to their Amazon Leo, Blue Origin Kuiper project, which is a much lower data rate RF signal for more enterprise activities. And that kind of plays into this dual mode of operation there. We've seen it with Starlink. They've deployed Starlink's now at 10,000 satellites as of this week. Yep. They have their own orbital data center play with their own hardware after their acquisition of XAI. And so this structure is very kind of well proposed by many companies. StarCloud has an interesting kind of barrier to overcome here, as they file to launch 88,000 satellites. I find this particularly interesting because a lot of their marketing material has shown that they are going to co-locate a lot of their compute capabilities, but at 88,000 satellites, this is definitely a LEO distributed constellation of satellites that need to be able to interplay together. StarCloud, compared to companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, even Google, are kind of lacking in that communication layer that's needed to connect all those terminals. So I'm really curious to see what their proposition is for bridging that gap and what all these companies are going to try to propose in order to actually connect them and be able to relay data around without fragmenting it too hard, because the RAID systems behind these are not well designed yet. There were some white papers out of Google following Project Suncatcher with Planet that's proposing a particular potential architecture for this, but how it actually plays out in production is going to be interesting to watch.
Moving on to Earth applications, there's I would argue, a pretty big demonstration mission that's going to be going up. So Link Global is pioneering some new capabilities in the direct-to-device industry. They have filed a request with the FCC for an experimental license to begin validation of their multi-orbit relay architecture. What does that mean? It means they're going to have LEO satellites that talk directly to devices and talk directly to cell phones, tablets, what have you. And then those LEO constellations are going to communicate up rather than laterally. So rather than passing signal along to other LEO assets and other LEO constellation assets, they're going to be passing that information up to MEO and or GEO assets and letting those big, slow, massive throughput satellites themselves effectively serve as orbital cell towers. So it's a really cool idea, and it's a really cool layer of infrastructure that potentially opens a whole lot of doors for the entirety of the industry. And the stuff that really interests me and that I'm most excited about is the fact that, for the most part, MEO is sort of fresh dirt. It's untilled land, it's fresh powder, it's unsoiled snow. There's not a lot in MEO. The reason there's not a lot in MEO is just because if you're putting something into MEO, traditionally, if you're trying to do something Earth observing, you'll get a better picture if you put it in LEO orbit. And if you're trying to do something that isn't Earth observing, you can get more capability, and you can do so at a comparable price point by just putting it in a GEO orbit. So you've seen this sort of sway, almost this bifurcation of the market, avoiding effectively the MEO. So the idea that by creating this additional architecture layer, that there could be a specific commercial use case for MEO, I find fascinating. We spoke last year, shortly after the Redshift article, we spoke about how China was intentionally targeting the MEO market and was intentionally focusing effort on getting assets up into MEO and winning some of that market share and becoming a leader in the MEO space, even though there's really nothing there. This was effectively a bet by the Chinese government that, hey, something's going to wind up being here, that eventually this real estate is going to become valuable. We're just getting in super early on it. We're getting in early enough to where we don't have to worry about any sort of return because we're not looking for a return. So I think it's fascinating that this is sort of playing out in this space potentially in real time. And I would love to sort of get your thoughts on that.
It's a good point it's a good point about China kind of dominating the MEO region. Some of their Guowang satellites and the 1,000 sail satellites that I talked about are operating that region. There's a lot of downsides to MEO in terms of, like, you don't get the sun synchronous orbits that are very popular for a lot of the Falcon 9 flights, or some of the repeat ground track orbits that you can get. But MEO is, besides that, relatively similar to LEO. If you can build out the architecture around it, you get a lot of the benefits of being close to Earth. But they also have the benefit of not having to deal with the regulatory hurdles of the crowded LEO environment. So definitely interesting to see a European player kind of expand into MEO. Like you said, it's not very popular for some of these Western nations. It is important to note that, like, Link Global is partnered with SES, and partnered meaning that SES is heavily invested in Link Global. And SES is a European geocom provider, communications provider that already has some satellites in these domains. So the architecture they're proposing with this particular filing is to use their LEO satellites developed by Link Global to connect to SES mPOWER satellites, of which there are about 70 currently in MEO, and the SES-17 satellite in GEO. The value they're proposing here is that, yes, instead of passing around to LEO and to the ground, you can pass it to GEO and MEO to create some of these connection kind of backhauls for Earth applications. They're particularly pointing out companies like AST Space Mobile and the gaps that they kind of have in their architecture, where when AST is able to downlink to the ground then has to transfer data between radio towers on ground. And that could be problems for, certain remote regions, also kind of defense denied regions. We talk a lot about like conflict zones where it's hard to get data to places that are being actively denied. And so this hybrid architecture is one that they're proposing to try to overcome some of those capabilities. And I think they're leveraging a lot of what they already have in this partnership to do that. Link Global is already tied closely to SES. They have a lot of resources on orbit, and they also recently merged with Omnispace, which provides them with 60 megahertz of S-band spectrum, which, as we've talked about with like the EchoStar deal where SpaceX paid $17 billion for spectrum, that S-band spectrum is very valuable. Like that's probably why they merged. SES has a lot of that S-band spectrum. So this kind of consortium that they've formed is really valuable just from a spectrum standpoint. Like S-band will give them a lot of capability. It's a very popular band. The fact that these three companies already own quite a bit of it, enough to do this kind of mission, is really important to note.
Yeah, I think the fact that there's additional sort of mergers that have happened in this space is really indicative as to how rapidly it's growing. Question for you, Harrison, but I would argue that to date, MEO has very much not been viewed as a security priority, that it's not been viewed as a priority for defense, national security, or any sort of asset or interest in that vein. At what point do you think it will be?
I don't know if I would think it would at all. Like there's not like the benefit of MEO is just that it's a larger area, it's less congested. It's still like China taking up all that space or as much as they can is one thing, but at the same time, they're also developing a lot of these RPO capabilities and the ability to interfere with other satellites. And MEO doesn't really protect you from that per se. I think some of these data centers are also going up at higher LEO orbits, like 1,000 kilometers. So I could see, I guess what I would envision MEO kind of blowing up is if the LEO congestion problem really does become real. If we reach a point where LEO is so congested that we can't manage the traffic and MEO is the only option, then I could see it becoming a more contested arena for space. I think the trade-offs of the benefits for LEO outweighed with the potential for kind of creating some Kessler syndrome down there might push a lot of these players out to MEO. That's really the only situation I would see, because MEO on its own doesn't really provide much benefit other than certain orchestration layers like we see with some of the tranches of PWSA, where they manage some of the lower Earth orbit satellites, like we said with SES here. Some of the Earth observation for like weather satellites are there, but really there's no like inherent value to MEO other than it's less congested.
Sure. I think in a quiet room, I agree with you. At the same time, I still think that it's just a matter of time before MEO winds up becoming a priority and becoming an intentional asset for security and defense purposes, just because I think that maintaining, if not a majority position in that space, will wind up, if not a majority, then like a plurality position in that segment of the space domain will wind up being a priority at some point. I think what it would take to get defense and security interests to really sort of cue in and prioritize that would be some combination of RPO and OTB capabilities, to where existing sort of LEO or existing GEO assets become effectively at risk from some MEO assets that are able to basically operate without any sort of surveillance, without any sort of potential interference or defenses against them.
I guess, okay, I will point out that there are a couple emerging trends. I think this is way early to call it, but space solar power and 6G technology, I think, will have some benefit in MEO. Like a lot of the space solar companies are proposing their satellites to go into MEO, and 6G technology kind of makes sense in MEO if we do away with terrestrial radio stations or radio towers, and maybe not do away entirely, but drastically reduce our reliance on them. Like a lot of the current non-terrestrial networks rely on 5G networks, but those are so intertwined with all of the radio stations that were stood up when 5G became a thing, like, I don't know, a decade ago at this point. I think when we get to the next layer of connectivity, like 6G, with the maturity of these communication satellites, there might be more of a push to not rely as heavily on ground infrastructure. Like it could actually be cheaper to stand up some of these MEO satellites as essentially space radio towers, because they would serve basically the same purpose. And in terms of space solar power, it's kind of a similar concept. Like I think space infrastructure, as we move more towards like persistent platforms that provide, broad connection between a lot of these more proliferated satellites, that is where MEO starts kind of playing a bigger role, because the proximity to Earth gives it a certain benefit, but being higher up with slower ground tracks and wider coverage, I think lends itself better to infrastructure plays.
Staying in Europe, Officina Stellare, an Italian manufacturer of advanced optomechanical systems, has signed a roughly $2 million contract with the Barcelona-based Institute of Photonic Sciences, ICFO. They made the announcement on St. Patrick's Day. The contract itself covers the design and construction of an optical ground station for future laser and quantum encrypted space-to-Earth communications. The infrastructure will include core optical ground station components from telescope to dome, from testing platforms to fully integrated control software. And what I found interesting about this was, it's a small contract, not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. We're going to discuss some multi-billion-dollar contracts that were awarded and extended in just a moment here. But what I found a little bit interesting, and I just wanted to touch on this a little bit, is that so it's a really quick turnaround for this ground station contract. 6 months it's supposed to be delivered, but the contract itself runs for an entire 12 months. So I'm supposed to deliver this to you in 6 months, and then for an extended period of time thereafter, the contract still runs. So it's effectively, what it boils down to is effectively baked in downside protection for ICFO should the delivery date slip in any capacity, or should some form of capacity post-delivery, if there's any sort of difficulties or challenges thereafter. There's a lot of revenues on the back end of the deal that are basically like, hey, we paid you so much up front, we paid you so much for the delivery, let's make sure the thing works. And that's a type of contract that you typically see in more capital intensive industries. But for whatever reason, it's one that we haven't seen as much of explicitly in the ground station network. So I just wanted to explain. I mean, we see that with satellites pretty frequently at Maxar and SSL. The vast majority of the revenue that the company was earning was driven by post-launch, by on-orbit operations. Granted, those contracts were for much longer timelines because those assets were supposed to stick around for 20 or 30 years. But just interesting to see, even for a shorter lead item, we're still seeing that play out in the same capacity.
Yeah, to me, the crazy part about this announcement is that it feels like all the optical ground terminal companies are coming out of Europe. Like last week, we had Swedish Space Company announcing their ground station in Chile after they put one in Western Australia. We've talked about recently K-Labs out of France doing their optical ground stations, and now we have Italy doing Officina Stellare. Even like this particular program is meant to not just demonstrate ground to space optical communication, but also quantum key distribution, quantum key encryption, which is something we saw Mynaric do the other 2 weeks ago. And so that's a German company. So we have Sweden, Germany, France, Italy, all demonstrating really cutting edge optical communications capabilities and security encryption from Earth to space. The other one that comes to mind is Kepler doing it with their constellation as well. They're Canadian. The U.S. has had some instances of showing that they can do this. I think they had a Psyche demonstration where they communicated by laser from Earth to Psyche, which is insane. But on the commercial side of things, I haven't seen any news coming out of the U.S. about standing up this capability. And so it's really crazy that Europe is pouring so much money into this and seemingly paying off. They're actually deploying these ground stations.
Well, the U.S. might not be explicitly investing in or explicitly developing its own ground station capabilities. They're definitely investing and prioritizing capability. So Raytheon is the recipient of a $2 billion contract extension to an existing roughly $1 billion contract, tripled overnight, for protected SATCOM terminals. This contract is intended to help provide more hacking, jamming, and interference resilient satellites for both GEO and MEO purposes. And it seems like rather than focusing on the terminals themselves and creating the quote unquote clean avenues of data transmission and communication, the US is focusing a little bit more on making sure that whatever avenues they use or whatever methods they're using for communication is harder to disrupt and intercept, jam, or obfuscate in any way. So a different approach, but a massive contract for Raytheon. Interesting to see how that's going to wind up playing out, given that the original contract, I believe, is just under a year old.
Yeah, it was last August. They granted 6 contracts to 6 different large prime contractors and Astranis, total random, to develop these ground terminals for their advanced, extremely high frequency satellites. So I find this is it's a really interesting follow-up to the optical terminal aspect. And it's making me question, are these 2 completely different approaches? And is it just based upon the infrastructure that we built in space? The advanced extremely high frequency satellites are a set of 6 satellites that the USS Space Force has already in orbit. And they operate at a crazy high frequency. It's 44 gigahertz, which is above microwave frequency. So what this allows them to do is create ultra narrow band, high frequency communications that are basically impossible to jam because they just have so much power. And so to jam, you would need crazy amount of disruption. And so they're basically just overpowering this by creating this ultra narrow band that can either avoid or just overpower a jammer. And so to me, it seems like a really interesting alternative to optical, and I'm still questioning whether this is a better approach. It uses phased array technology to kind of focus this signal, and it's more in line with what we're seeing on the US side of development. Things like Cesium Astro creating their phased array antennas, AST Space Mobile creating their phased array antennas, Northwood, their ground terminals are all phased array receivers. So there seems to almost be a objection to the idea that optical terminals are the most secure, the most high throughput, the best option. In that, there are still some downsides to optical terminals. They're hard to maintain a connection. It's a very new technology developing that. Having adaptive optics to kind of steer the beam through the atmosphere is still very challenging. So it might just be that the US is betting more heavily on a technology that's more developed, that serves essentially the same purpose, but is more proliferated across all of the satellites and ground stations that they're developing. So this Raytheon, contract in particular is to develop mobile ground stations. So this is pretty high-tech stuff, being able to move these ground stations around, primarily for the Marines and the U.S. Army to communicate with these satellites is a pretty heavy technology. So adding $2 billion to the budget, while I don't love it, is not that crazy, given that the technology they're developing is pretty advanced.
The fundamental sort of difference between Europe clearly choosing and prioritizing optical terminals and the US clearly choosing and prioritizing phased array it makes me wonder if there's an aspect to that continued investment and adoption of phased array terminals on the US of like, well, not to call it a sunk costs fallacy, but effectively like, look, we're already a lap and a half ahead when it comes to phased array. We're already the global leaders in this. We'll just continue to use phased array rather than sort of jumping into the scrum with everybody else, where what we're offering is, and what we're able to do is no different than what anybody else is able to do. So it makes me wonder if there's like, okay, well, maybe in like 5 to 10 years time, optical terminals and optical relay will itself just outstrip the capabilities of phased array. And that sort of phased array lead or supremacy, if you will, has a clock on it. But I wouldn't be surprised if the US already has, hundreds of billions of dollars invested in phased array, and the cost of switching and adopting a new sort of ground station fundamental architecture in transitioning to optical basically winds up just sort of pricing them out. So like, hey, this is where we've already cut this check. We have to make this work. We have to find ways to make this infrastructure and architecture work. And we, at some point, maybe we can figure out how to adapt and incorporate and involve optical terminals. But for now, the cost of switching or adopting a new technology that itself we don't have strong leadership in is too high. Additionally, GomSpace joins the European Defense Agency consortium to develop a VLEO military satellite concept. So they announced their selection as a key industrial partner in a roughly 16 million euro research contract awarded by the EDA. The initiative, managed by the VLEO DEF Consortium, or VLEO Defense Consortium, aims to develop Europe's first dedicated military satellite concept for very low Earth orbit. So this is the first explicit effort in militarizing and providing defense and security assets in VLEO. VLEO does not yet have extensive commercial use cases. They exist. They are absolutely going to be developed. But this is one of the few cases in the space industry that we've seen in recent years of defense leading or defense preceding defense priorities or goals preceding commercial interest and preceding commercial goals. So already we've seen massive amounts of spending and massive amounts of defense budget allocated to existing assets and data types. We've seen that allocated to synthetic aperture radar, for example, a well-established data layer. We've seen it allocated to existing Earth observation satellites, well-established pieces of technology in both RGB, SAR, and hyperspectral imaging satellites. And now we're seeing that expand. We've already seen it start to expand to infrared data products and infrared types of assets, but we're now seeing that expand to assets themselves that are not well established or not well defined. So we're seeing that expand into VLEO. And unlike MEO, I am not at all surprised to see this sort of development happening at this speed.
Yeah, I feel like this is kind of a misnomer. Like, it's not the architecture they're proposing for the VLEO Def consortium is interesting, but it almost works entirely around the problems with VLEO. Primarily that, atmosphere drags you down. So having to stay up for a prolonged period of time is difficult. And that's the challenge that all the incumbents are trying to overcome. So, there's companies like Veridian, Kraos, Redwire, Albedo that are all have, ways of overcoming VLEO. But this VLEO Def consortium is essentially proposing that you sit a satellite in LEO, and then depending on some activity that triggers it, it will move down to VLEO for heightened observation capabilities, but then move back up to LEO when it's done. So it basically just avoids the entire problem of staying in VLEO for a prolonged period of time by mainly sitting in LEO. It's a cool concept, but it's basically just a LEO spacecraft. What it really is playing at is the space mobility concept that's been way more popular in Europe than VLEO. And so it's a cool sign that they're still trying to develop out this capability. GomSpace is pretty new to that arena as well, although they have a great space heritage. So really cool program. I'm really hesitant to call it like a VLEO effort, but it's cool that VLEO is getting more attention recently.
I would wholeheartedly agree with your assessment that it's very much being sort of miscategorized as VLEO, and at the same time would say like point proven, that like the capabilities of fully defined VLEO assets, like they don't even exist yet. None of the companies that we've been discussing have commercially available, extensive, like these products have not yet made it to market in a scalable or reasonable way for any sort of sustained or wide scale business operations. And already we are seeing explicit military spending in trying to get capacity and trying to get capability in that asset class, even if it is just for a visit. We're already seeing people in with explicit sort of defense and security backing, trying to solve those problems before commercial has solved them.
Yeah, I mean, like I don't know. I feel like I'm harping on this point, but like highly elliptical orbits, like Molniya or like Tundra orbits, like it, by this definition, they're also VLEO applications. So like we've already done this in the way that they're proposing. So really, it's just like creating a spacecraft that's able to move between domains often and quickly.
Satellogic has unveiled the Merlin constellation for daily monitoring at 1 meter resolution. It's an expansion of their Aleph observer, which has 10 spectral bands, onboard AI, and an inter-satellite link.
So this is an interesting proposal for Satellogic. They've traditionally been selling, we talked about them recently as selling like bunches of imaging satellites for other companies. Like I think we talked about the Spanish like civil engineering agency a couple months ago, buying like 10 satellites from them. They are basically like a Spanish competitor to Planet in a lot of ways. They're somewhat competitive with like Black Sky and Vantor in terms of high resolution imaging. And this proposal is an interesting, not pivot, but like kind of expansion upon their capabilities. The daily monitoring aspect is not so crazy. Like Planet does that already. Black Sky is probably getting to that point. But the daily revisit at 1 meter resolution is kind of crazy. Like Planet can get daily revisit, but they're at 3 meters resolution. So this is, tripling that, which is not insignificant. And to kind of develop their own internal constellation, I'm not sure where they're getting the funding for this. Like they've gotten a lot of money through contracts, but it's to sell satellites. So to stand up their own constellation is pretty interesting. It's interesting to see it off the back of Open Constellation's proposal a couple weeks ago to plug in their, I think it's like 100 satellite imaging constellation to their Open Cosmos constellation that they're going to launch. So there seems to be this appetite from Europe to have higher revisit at higher resolution for their constellations. But I just feel like it's stiff competition against a lot of the US incumbents like Vantor, like Planet. And I would say particularly Black Sky. This 1 meter resolution is pretty high, but it's really only high if you consider it in the context of daily revisit. Like Black Sky can get down to 35 centimeters, which is significantly better. And they are making money hand over fist in a way that I think allows them to scale out a constellation in a lot more profitable of a way than Satellogic is proposing here. So whether this actually plays out will be interesting to watch. Everything they're listing is pretty state of the art. So if they actually deploy it, that's a huge boon for Europe. On to rockets. We have a lot of smaller players making big moves this week. Reaction Dynamics, a Canadian launch vehicle company, was awarded an initial $8.3 million tranche under phase 1 of the Responsive Light Lift Stream from the Canadian Space Agency. This is supporting their company's development roadmap toward a maiden orbital launch targeted for 2028. This is a particularly interesting win, given that the Launch the North program that's funding them picked 3 different Canadian launch vehicle companies, which is all of the Canadian launch vehicle companies. So this is a very clear signal from the Canadian government that they want sovereign launch capability, and they're going to fund every chance they have to get there. Reaction Dynamics has a great vehicle they're working on. Nord Space is another winner of this grant, and the Canada Rocket Company was a third, although they got embroiled in some drama under the IP ownership of the launch vehicle coming out of a certain university that sued the owner of that. So it's likely they aren't going to be a third selection. And so it's really going to come down to Reaction Dynamics and Nord Space standing up some of these capabilities. Both of them are small lift vehicles, pretty common for early stage rocket companies, especially with this little amount of funding. But it should hopefully go a long way in getting them into a operational launch capability.
Yeah, congratulations to Bashar and the team over at Reaction Dynamics. This is a really big win for them. So love to see it. Congratulations to everybody involved.
Rocket Lab has had a big week, winning their largest launch contract yet, $190 million for 20 launches of their HASTE vehicle. This is different than the normal reporting on their Electron launches. I think they're up to like 80 successful launches now. Just great track record. The HASTE vehicle is a little less commonly launched. It's only been for demo purposes, but this is 20 launches of HASTE for hypersonics testing for the Department of War. This is in conjunction with Kratos to do hypersonic testing. And this is out of their wall of space, which is really well designed for this kind of testing. And it follows a larger trend that we've seen with hypersonics becoming a large investment point across the industry. Primarily for missiles. So we don't talk about it a whole lot, but Rocket Lab being a space company first, this is an interesting way for them to bring in a lot of money. And, this likely will have follow-on implications past these 20 launches. I have no doubt they'll go off without a hitch. And this will become really valuable to the United States and, defense development of hypersonic missile technology. So looking forward to seeing how these launches go. Also coming out of this kind of branch of missile testing is the U.S. Space Force's award of $446.8 million to Kratos for MEO missile tracking ground segment. So like I said, Kratos is deeply involved with the hypersonics testing for the U.S. government. We've talked about multiple of their contracts for ground segments technology, missile technology, like different technologies to test interception of missiles on orbit. So they're deeply involved with missile development and hypersonics. And we're seeing that this week across multiple programs. So like I said, they're involved with the hypersonics testing through Rocket Lab, but they've also won this large MEO missile tracking ground segment contract. So this is to develop the technology needed to connect all the ground segments for this system, which is a already established missile tracking system by the USS Space Force. So I know we throw around a lot of different programs here. PWSA, SDA has theirs, MDA has theirs, US Air Force, US Space Force. This is a particularly interesting one. It's been stood up over the past years by the US Space Force through a series of what are called EPIC contracts. So it's a way to kind of stage out this capability. These are satellites that are deployed to medium Earth orbit. As we talked about, there are some value to having them there. They're fairly responsive, easier to coordinate. And the EPIC contracts were brought out through two layers. The first being 12 contracts to Millennium Aerospace, which we talked about very recently, having invested $10 million into their production capacity to scale this out, and 10 in the EPIC 2 layer to BAE, formerly Ball Aerospace, to develop the second layer of this. So all these satellites are able to track missiles from medium Earth orbit. Kratos is stepping in to coordinate all of those across the ground segments that receive the signals from these missile tracking to do some of the like fire command stuff. We see this a lot with like Golden Dome, PWSA. This is interesting to see that there's kind of a distinct effort from U.S. Space Force to stand up this set of satellites and missile tracking capability. On the European side of things, ISAR has won a contract from Astroscale to launch their ELSA-M satellite. This is particularly interesting given that ISAR has yet to successfully launch a vehicle. They launched their Spectrum rocket last year, but it failed about 30 seconds into flight due to a control issue. They are actually 3 days out from their second attempt, and fingers crossed that goes well for them. They're launching out of the Andoya spaceport. They had to stand down the Spectrum launch recently due to some technical issues, but it looks like they're go for launch on the 23rd. So if all things go well on that launch, it looks like they're poised to launch an actual satellite through Astroscale. The ELSA-M is a orbital debris removal satellite, so really exciting to see that go up. This is one of the satellites we talked about recently under the ARTIS program. It's a UK program to do orbital removal, and this particular ELSA-M satellite is going to go up and remove a OneWeb satellite out of orbit to demonstrate the ability to remove defunct satellites. I think it's a very interesting trend, given that we saw Starfish Space win a very similar contract to remove a PWSA satellite under the USSF a few months ago. So it looks like the UK ESA is kind of parroting this capability through this proposal.
Yeah, there's definitely some close mirrors here. I mean, this is effectively just a really high risk sort of launch and mission. The fact that this is a new launch provider who's looking at providing additional capacity and additional inventory to the market. We'd love to see it. We absolutely want them to succeed. So it would make sense that they're effectively sort of launching a high risk sort of mission that, like, well, if this didn't go super well, we weren't entirely sure whether or not it would go well on orbit either. So it makes sense to sort of see all of that, but love to see everything that is being demonstrated here by this mission. So moving on to some of the business moves from the past week, MDA Space is now officially trading on the New York Stock Exchange. After making a total of just under 10 million common shares available at a $30.50 US price point, they raised a total of $300 million in their IPO on the New York Stock Exchange, and the new US listing joins its previous listing on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So this is something that MDA has actually been pursuing for a good little while. It was part of the motivation, I would argue, for the merger with Digital Globe and the creation of Maxar Technologies, was to get access to the American markets more directly, both from a capital perspective and from a contract and investment perspective. So huge milestone for the team. Congrats to everybody there and great job in navigating all of the various sort of challenges and hurdles necessary in order to do so. That's a huge win for everyone there.
Yeah, this is likely money they need to deploy the Telesat LEO, or the Telesat Lightspeed constellation. They have 200 satellites on contract to deliver for Telesat, and they are trying to rapidly deploy this constellation to compete with Starlink. The value of that constellation is roughly the same amount that they raised. So deploying their Aurora satellites for Telesat is likely their highest priority right now, especially given that one of their contracts fell through with Globalstar recently.
Yeah, I think we reported on that fall through contract, or on that contract's falling through.
Yeah, so I think this is likely, I wouldn't say existential. They have other lines of business, but like this is a huge demonstration of their communications constellation capability, a huge value for Canada. As we talked about, they want their own sovereign capabilities. So likely all money is going towards making sure they can deploy that on time, show that capability, and hopefully build upon that for future constellation wins.
Reorbit has sold 2 Silta small geospatial satellites to SLI for 150 million euros. And this is fascinating for a couple of reasons. So Space Leasing International, now SLI Space or SLI Aerospace, has already bought a couple of small geostationary geospatial satellites from other new space small sat providers. The price point for Reorbit is roughly 70 to 80 million per satellite. The price point for their previous purchase, which came from, I believe, Ascendarc, was closer to 50 to 60 million US per satellite. So comparable, same sort of ballpark, same sort of price point here. But this is a fascinating shakeup for the geostationary and the geospatial industry as a whole. These new space players are providing satellites at 20 to 30% of the incumbent geostationary solution. So you're able to get the same or comparable satellites for just a fraction of the cost. On top of that, SLI is pushing the business model of owning these assets themselves and then leasing them or selling capacity to whomever the end buyer needs to be. Now, whether that winds up looking more like selling to distressed buyers, selling to folks who, for whatever reason, a satellite launch did not follow through as necessary. They needed to have a satellite up on orbit by for example, April 1st, but that got pushed. So that got pushed back to August 1st. So now all of a sudden they have these 3 or 4 months of gap in their capability providers. So whether SLI would be leasing assets to folks who are like, oh, dear goodness, we need to get some sort of capability and we need to get some form of capacity on orbit today in order to meet our contract needs. That's one potential option. The other potential option would be more of a sort of rental property type thing where folks would be able to access for a higher marginal cost, but a vastly lowered cost overall, just be able to access a geostationary or geospatial assets data, throughput, or capability in any capacity, and what that winds up looking like. Either way, whether this is focused more on providing a full satellite and full satellite capabilities to an individual buyer or an individual user or customer for whatever sort of time they need, or whether it's more about turning around and effectively leasing this entire asset to somebody else on a much more long-term deal where that person is or that customer is focused more on just the annual payment of the satellite rather than needing to pay for half of the satellite up front. Whichever sort of model it is, more effectively more short-term or long-term rentals, it's a complete game changer for the geospatial industry.
Yeah, it's something we're not like strangers to coming from Space Systems Loral. Like they've done it with several competitors like HughesNet and Eutelsat SES. Like this business model is not new, but it is interesting that this company kind of got stood up around that Ascendarc acquisition, and it is new for this micro geocom satellite market. What I'm really curious to see is if they end up buying anything from Astranis or Swiss to 12, which are the other two microsatellite providers, or if they really saw some value, particularly out of Ascendarc and Reorbit, which honestly, until they mentioned them, I would have thought they were one of the less established kind of players in that arena. So maybe they're just being competitive on price. But I do find this model very interesting that leasing almost makes more sense given the micro geo com architecture, and that it's a much more targeted capability than the traditional large geocom satellites. Most of it was leasing out from different kind of regions within the country that bought the satellite. But I think with this, you might see some more dynamicism to who can lease for what. And I think that plays better into the emerging market of proliferated constellations and kind of how these satellites have starting to play a role as like backhaul to the more broad coverage constellations. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, both in like you're bridging the gap of constellations, but I'm also curious to see if this has any implications to like defense communications capabilities and standing stuff up for conflict zones, things that pop up, natural disaster zones, things that are like dynamic and need short-lived but quickly accessible communications capability.
So in February, York Space finalized a $187 million contract for a constellation based on their M-class bus, roughly 20 to 24 assets going into this constellation. And this was announced and followed through as one of the highlights of their Q4 earnings report. Now, according to that earnings report, this contract constitutes roughly half of their annual revenue. I don't believe that this contract was counted in that revenue, but for scale, this $187 million contract is half of their annual revenue. So it's a big win for them. Now, the M-class bus supports payloads up to 1,000 kilograms and, more importantly, provides 8 kilowatts of peak power. So it is a very high-powered satellite bus. And the contract itself is not for actual satellites. It's just for the bus. At least as I understand it, the York Space Systems isn't providing the entirety of the satellite to the end customer. They're just providing the M-class bus that the end customer will then construct and adapt as needed. So that's pretty interesting because these 20 buses we'll say it's 20. I mean, but these buses are 9.5, 10 million a pop, which means that the total satellite itself is somewhere between, 30 to 50 million, maybe 30 to 60 million a pop, which, okay, if we keep that up, let's say it's 30 million, but who do we know who would have a $600 million very unique, very specialized use case for a satellite constellation where they need cutting edge, top of the line, super high powered satellite capabilities? I couldn't think of any potential commercial uses. It seems to me like this would wind up most likely being a DoD or a government contract that hasn't been fully announced.
Well, but they said in their earnings report that it's for a commercial customer. Like, they didn't disclose who it was, but they clearly said it's commercial, which just leads me to the same confusion of like, who the heck needs 8 kilowatts of power? Like, I've worked on kilowatt satellites and those were considered high power. Like, the main customers were the government. Like, nobody needs that level of power. So, and even the customers that do, like, they're mostly bus providers themselves. Like, they would build a high power satellite like Apex or K2 or somebody that is filling the same need of like defense satellites, because like this class of satellite was built for PWSA. Like, they launched 16 satellites. I think they're contracted for 21 so far, and I'm expecting 33 more given that Orbital purchase. But that's where it makes sense, like these high gain, high frequency RF satellite constellations that need to exist in proliferated status. So like, what commercial application needs high gain communications? Like, the only other applications I can think of are like orbital data centers, but they would need even higher power than that. So like MEO satellites. So it's not even that we're talking like MEO coordinators or like geo backhaul. Like, I could maybe see it if somebody has a constellation in low Earth orbit that needs a higher orbit, like coordination satellite, similar to like what York Space is doing with PWSA. But I couldn't think of that many customers. Like, maybe Google, but they're so early in their play that it doesn't make any sense.
I think they're probably calling Raytheon a commercial customer.
That
like
I think it's prediction.
I think it's probably something to that effect, that like ultimate end user, end consumer of this product is going to wind up being USG or DoD. But they're contracting through a technically commercial customer to get there.
See, the only other one I could think of is like Cesium Astro, because I haven't seen them talk about their bus that much, but they have a great payload and it's a high power optically linked payload. Like, this to me would be a great collaboration. So that's what that is.
I mean, why would you play that close to the vest though?
Because they're government related. I don't know.
All right. Well,
I mean, it's like I think we've been predicting that Cesium is playing. Actually, I don't think it's a prediction. I think they've announced that they're working on like a TACSAT constellation. Like, to me, that's the perfect opportunity for that. Like, they raised 500 million. They have an ultra high power payload that would require that kind of power, and it's for a defense adjacent application like SATCOM. So my prediction would be them.
It's better than anything I can come up with off the top of my head.
There's just not that many players that have 200 million to drop on high power satellites.
I mean, get a hat together. I think we could put together a pretty good crack at this. Additionally, Apex, the California-based satellite manufacturer, has won a contract from the Japanese-based NEC Corporation to provide a spacecraft bus for a technology demonstration mission. Delivery is scheduled for 2027. This is one of Apex's first commercial orders. Congratulations to the team. This is their first order in Japan. They're expanding their global footprint. And the ultimate use case for the bus is going to be a 1,000-kilometer altitude LEO asset.
Actually, now that you say Apex, I'm going to throw Anduril into the mix there, because Anduril is like the only other person that purchased from Apex, and they have some partnership with K2 Space. So like, Apex has some pretty high power buses. I think this is for their Ares platform, which is like high power, but not crazy high power. They have some higher power satellites in the works. But Anduril certainly has enough money, and they've expressed interest in expanding their space applications. I think their partnership with Apex was to do some like geo stuff. and their stuff with K2 is also geo related, and they just bought Exo Analytic for 100 million or something crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about that last week, but you think they're going to go from immediately acquiring another company to dropping $500 million on a satellite constellation?
I mean, it makes sense, right? Exo Analytics and SDA, kind of
I mean,
like what if they go from SDA to like missile defense? Like it's an easy enough pivot for them. Like it
that's
makes
true.
sense given their ground capabilities.
That's true. I just think they've just doubled the size of their team with that acquisition. There's going to be so much friction in getting everybody on the same page and getting everything pointed in the right direction. Like I, maybe this is something that they've been working on for a long time, but in my mind, both the acquisition and this sort of contract are massive undertakings in executing properly. I'd be super surprised if they were trying to effectively do both simultaneously.
So this week in Tech Advances, we have some, cool proposals. Whether or not any of these actually turn out to execute will be interesting to watch. Coming out of the gate is Portal Space Systems with their announcement to partner with Paladin Space to provide debris removal as a service. This will use Portal Space Systems Starburst spacecraft and Paladin Triton's payload to do the RPO and capture of orbital debris. This is a pretty interesting partnership. Portal Space Systems, we talked about a month ago following our interview with Atomic Six's Trevor Smith and their partnership to use Atomic Six's debris protection plates for Portal Space Systems satellite. So Portal Space Systems doing a lot of work in orbital debris. Their system is not like overtly tailored towards that application. They're basically a high mobility spacecraft. Of course, that leaves it very open to whatever applications they want to do with that mobility. And we usually see that in companies like Impulse Space, where they've talked about that kind of capability. And that was more for like orbital transfer vehicle stuff. And some of the more emerging trends are for like for RPO capabilities for space defense applications. So I always love to see debris removal, debris mitigation as an application. Whether or not this is a great application for Portal Space System satellite is yet to be seen. I think it does lend itself well to multi-operation missions for the spacecraft, which is great because that's one of the main downsides to orbital debris vehicles is you basically use a whole vehicle to remove a whole other vehicle, and it kind of just nets out to zero on the cost, and that's not scalable. So hopefully they have a new approach to this. And it's, I'm curious to see if Atomic Six's debris plates play a role in this, because as Trevor mentioned to us, like the debris plates don't just block debris, they actually capture the debris they block. So I'm a little curious if they're going to use this in conjunction with Paladin, or maybe they have a different like design with Atomic Sixes to just ram into the debris if it's smaller and capture it that way. But either way, I think it's great Portal's approaching some of this debris problems. I think they have a really unique spacecraft to do it. On the orbital manufacturing side of things, Frontier Space was awarded funding from the UK Space Agency under Project Bridge to develop biopharmaceutical solutions with the Exploration Company. So this is a UK international bilateral fund move to partner Frontier Space, which is a UK company, with Exploration Company, which is a German company. We've been talking a lot recently about UK-German relations in space, usually adversarial, like Orbex got blocked from being bought by a German company, and there wasn't great friendship between German technology being transferred to some of these UK companies. So it's great to see some collaboration here. Frontier Space announced this collaboration in conjunction with some commercial biopharma company. They weren't clear on that, but given that we talked a month ago about Frontier partnering with Azenta Life Sciences, I'm going to say it's them. They are developing biopharmaceuticals using, improved microcrystalline structures on orbit with microgravity to develop more effective and longer lasting biopharmaceuticals. This is a pretty interesting collaboration with the Exploration Company. I think they came up recently with some funding. They're making great progress towards developing their Nix vehicle, which is a human-rated space capsule, primarily used for docking with on-orbit habitats. So they're more so playing in that realm. But given the technology needed to do that, it actually plays pretty well with on-orbit manufacturing. So they're basically using this capsule that's primarily meant for humans to just launch raw material, manufacture, and then come back down to Earth using the heat shields that they've already developed in order to return those humans to Earth. Lastly, today we have TransAstra announcing a plan to bring an asteroid back to Earth. So all you oil miners, get ready to play out Armageddon round 2. This company is developing a device that can capture material. They've tested it on the ISS at small scales, and then NASA funded them $2.5 million to scale it up to a 10-meter bag. But with this proposal, they're talking about capturing a 20-meter large asteroid, or potentially multiple asteroids, and then bringing it back to the Earth-Sun Lagrange 2 point to allow for other operators to sort of run experiments and demonstrations on those asteroids to develop more easily asteroid mining capabilities. Given past asteroid mining efforts, it's hard to just get out to an asteroid, let alone actually mine it and bring it back and actually have that iteration loop shortened by bringing it closer to Earth. I think is a great idea. Some of my favorite missions are the Hayabusa missions out of JAXA. Those took years. They were successful, but they took years for them to go out to the asteroid and collect like a few grams of sample from that. And I just don't think that's scalable to operate on that level if we actually want to make this a commercial capability. So while I think this is kind of far-fetched, and TransAstra is still looking for a satellite to partner with to put their payload bag on, it's cool that somebody is proposing kind of a new take to asteroid mining.
Yeah, I mean, asteroid mining has been a incredibly fun and interesting and high-minded pursuit for a while now. I can think of 4 or 5 different companies that have sort of come and gone because effectively they've been too early on the industry. But I'd be fascinated to understand why TransAstra thinks that now is the right time to be pursuing this. I mean, I agree it sounds a little bit far-fetched just because it's such a technically demanding, such a challenging mission to accomplish, though the goal of actually bringing the mass and bringing the material back to the Lagrange points locally before then processing and adapting everything is absolutely the way to go. But I'd be curious as to better understanding sort of what their thought process is as to like, yes, this is going to work now. It didn't work 10 years ago. It didn't work 5 years ago, but this works now. This is going to be big for the foreseeable future.
I don't know. It's a weird, like you point out, like Deep Space Industries and Planetary Resources were kind of like the two vanguards of this market in our industry. And just like this past week, we saw layoffs out of Carmen Plus, who's doing asteroid mining, and Astroforge actually moving into environmental testing for their spacecraft. So there is kind of another wave to asteroid mining, but all of them have taken the approach of we need to build a satellite that can go all the way out, mine stuff, and bring it back. I think this is thinking a little past that. And honestly, I'm just excited to see like more players trying to take a different swing at this. That's a wrap for this week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Substack, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Until next time, this is Harrison Lambert and Paul Mayer signing off for now.